Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 23rd of February. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined today by Linda Fabiani, the previously an SNP MSP, forgive me, and Deputy Presiding Officer in the Scottish Parliament. Welcome, Linda.
Hi.
And also we're joined by Ian Fraser. Ian is a journalist and author of Shredded Inside the RBS, the bank that broke Britain. Thank you again, Ian, for giving up a big chunk of your weekend for us here today.
Good morning.
Thank you. So usually we start the show with a Ukraine update, but today we're actually just going to move on to, going to start with Gaza. We'll come to Ukraine next. So at least 48,329 Palestinians have been killed and 111,753 people have been wounded in Gaza since the 7th of October in 2023. Hamas returned the bodies of 4 dead hostages on Thursday and released 6 more of the surviving hostages yesterday. However, Israel has suspended the release of 620 Palestinians and thereby threatening the ceasefire. Ian, can I come to you first? No, sorry, Linda. I'm sorry. I always start this by coming to women guests first. I'm so sorry.
It's quite all right.
Reverse
sexism.
Forgive
Brian,
me.
that's what
No, well, you're right. It probably is true. But anyway, Linda, do you think can either side be trusted to do the right thing to keep the ceasefire on track?
Oh, it's a really difficult one. I mean, I know the second stage of the ceasefire deal is to be agreed by, I think, next Saturday. And here we are at the end of the first one, and it seems that both sides are very much blotting their copybooks here. It is a difficult one because you can't talk about these things in isolation, Brian. There's a whole history behind it that it, shows it all. But I was personally, quite shocked at the way Hamas handed over some hostages. But then for many, many years, I've been very shocked about the way Israel has dealt with Palestine. And I know too that even with the release of some of the Palestinian detainees, that has been used for propaganda purposes as well, locally. I'm worried about Israel not at this late stage fulfilling their part of the bargain and releasing some of the detainees back to Palestine, because it's almost like a standoff, maybe a negotiating position before the next stage of the ceasefire. That's really concerning. And meanwhile, there's still terrible things going on in the West Bank, which has always been part of what's going on here through the war and through the process. Oh, I just keep hoping beyond hope that we're not going to see an eruption of violence again. And I know that there are those in Netanyahu's government, the extreme right wingers, who really don't want the second part of the process to carry on without Hamas being obliterated as they see it. And also, I read something that said some of them are also demanding the rights of settlement in the Strip. So that's really hard what's going on. Meanwhile, we've got Mr. Trump in the background. However, his envoy is talking this week, some quite positive things about the way forward. So let's hope that this carries on and that we don't have a postponement of the peace process. Well, not even the peace process, the ceasefire.
Thank you, Linda. So this week, Northern Ireland leader Michelle O'Neill said that she's going to boycott the White House St. Patrick's Day celebrations over Trump's stance on Gaza. You mentioned Trump, Linda, and we're going to be talking about the Labour conference later on in the show. But Ian, apparently there was a head of the Palestinian mission to the UK, Hussam Zomlot, was at the conference yesterday and spoke to a fringe event that Anis Sarwar attended, and he said that he wanted Palestine to be recognised as a state. Do you think that's going to happen anytime soon?
Or I think it. I mean, obviously that would be the preferred outcome, but I can't see it happening anytime soon, unfortunately. I mean, this latest on the part of the Israelis in handing over more than 600 Palestinian prisoners seems to be prompted by Benjamin Netanyahu, who has demanded that Hamas stops doing what he calls the cynical use of hostages for propaganda purposes. And I think he's referring to the kind of displays that happen whenever hostages are released. There's a lot of armed Hamas militants, with guns parading around and lots of banners. But, Hamas claims that it's doing it in a dignified and humanitarian way. So there's a conflict of opinion over the method, the actual show that's put on when hostages are released. And I sincerely hope that is not going to be, going to be something that stops this process from continuing.
Thank you, Ian. Linda, I think I may be misrepresented that. I think I might be right in saying that the Palestinian diplomat was calling on Labour to recognise Palestine as a state. Do you think? I think possible. I'm just rereading my notes. Do you think Labour would ever come out and support that?
Well, I hope so. For decades now, main political parties have been talking about the only answer being a two-state solution. And there was a time when the Labour Party in the UK was very much at the forefront of that. I understand that in diplomatic terms, now is not the time, really, for anybody to be making big declarations when they're in a position of, government in the UK and other things. I understand all that. That's what diplomacy is all about. But to me, Palestinians should have a state. There should be a state of Palestine. There's absolutely no doubt about that in my mind. The current Israeli government don't want that at all. That's become very, very clear. But there are a lot of ordinary Israeli folks who, if we try and take away the very heightened emotions that this conflict has brought about, there are a lot of ordinary Israeli folks who see the justice of a two-state solution and would like to see that progressed. So I'm not convinced that those in power in the US do now, which is another worry. But I hope that the Labour Party will, what I think is actually reaffirm their wish for a Palestinian state, because I'm pretty sure that was their policy for a long time previously.
Thank you, Linda. Now we will move on to the Ukraine update. Today is the 1096th day of the war in Ukraine. Yesterday, President Zelensky praised UK leadership on the war with Russia after Sir Keir Starmer pledged his ironclad support for Kyiv in a phone call. Ahead of a planned meeting with Donald Trump this week, Starmer insisted that Ukraine must be at the heart of any negotiations on a peace deal with Russia. In another call on Saturday, EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Sir Keir Starmer discussed the need to secure a just and enduring peace in Ukraine. The UK will unveil a significant package of sanctions against Russia on Monday, according to the Foreign Secretary David Lammy. A new poll has found that about 62% of UK citizens believe Ukraine should be allowed into NATO. And Russia launched several waves of missile and drone attacks over Saturday night, targeting Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine, killing one civilian in Kryvyi and damaging buildings and cars in Kyiv and elsewhere, officials said early this morning. Russia's defence ministry said that its air defence units had intercepted and destroyed 20 Ukrainian drones overnight over 6 regions. And a 70-year-old woman was killed and 3 others injured in Russian-guided bomb attacks on the industrial city of Kostyantynivka in the eastern Donetsk region. A second meeting between representatives of Russia and the US is planned for the next 2 weeks, the RIA, Russian state news agency, reported yesterday, quoting Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, that preparations for a face-to-face meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin were underway. Earlier this morning, Vladimir Putin said that meeting the needs of troops fighting in Ukraine and boosting the armed forces were Russia's key strategic priorities. And US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has urged UN members to approve a new US proposed resolution on the Ukraine war that, according to diplomats, omits any mention of territory occupied by Russia. The US wants the UN Security Council to vote on a brief draft resolution marking the third anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine on Monday, before the 193-member General Assembly votes on the same text. The US moved it against Ukraine and the EU, who for the past month have been negotiating with UN member states on their own drafts for the text on the war. And US Secretary Scott Bessent has said that an economic partnership between Ukraine and the US would benefit both countries. Bessent said the US had proposed revenue received by Ukraine's government from natural resources, infrastructure and other assets be allocated to a US-controlled fund to pay the long-term reconstruction and development of Ukraine. And Volodymyr Zelensky is not ready to sign a deal that would give the US preferential access to his country's critical minerals, according to AFP reports. Donald Trump has demanded Kyiv supply the US with the resources to pay for military aid already received. Zelensky has so far rejected US proposals for the harsh terms and lack of security guarantees for Ukraine. The White House National Security Advisor said Zelensky should tone down his complaints about the US and sign that deal. Russia claimed its forces had captured the village of Novolyubivka, in Ukraine's eastern Luhansk region. The Ukrainian army controls a handful of localities in Luhansk, whose annexation Moscow illegally claimed in 2022. Ian, that point in today's update about the US demanding access to Ukraine's earth minerals to pay for money already handed over to fund the military there. This is all beginning to sound existential for the Ukraine's existence, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, Trump did promise he was going to end the war within 24 hours after he became US president, and that happened on 20th of January. Since then, things have gone. It's been a bit of a wild ride, I think, for anyone involved in diplomacy. But the latest moves by the US under Donald Trump, involving Marco Rubio and others, including Scott Bessent, just show a country which is basically answering to Putin's call and doing whatever Putin wants, more or less whatever Putin wants. So the aggressor who full-scale invaded Ukraine back, when was it, 3 years ago, is now being treated as if it deserves everything it can get. And Trump to try and claim the rights to rare earth minerals that are being mined in Ukraine in compensation for the money the US has paid out so far is it just beggars belief. I mean, and obviously not inviting Zelensky to any of the talks to date is another sign of total mishandling of the situation and a total breakdown in what we understood to be the world order since NATO was founded in 1949.
Thank you, Ian. A couple of things that you said. Apparently there's a diplomatic saying that says nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. And you've actually already answered one of the questions I was thinking about asking, which is Trump doing Putin's bidding? But Linda, I don't know, how galling do you think it must be for President Zelensky, because he now has to listen to the propaganda previously spouted by Russia, and it's now being spouted by Trump and his pals.
Aye. The whole thing's horrifying. I mean, I agree with everything Ian said there, and I feel President Zelensky, I'm just aghast at how this must feel. Here's this guy been defending the rights of his country, over that last few years, the country that was invaded by Russia, and all of a sudden he's been treated as if he is as much to blame as anybody else. In fact, beyond that, as if it's all his own fault. It's absolutely horrifying. And the bully boy tactics that Trump uses are horrendous and bode badly, I would say, for the world order, as you mentioned. But what gets me too is there's a couple of things that I find it really hard to get my head around. When I think about how the United States of America, for all this time, has been totally terrified of communism, from way back, through the McCarthy trials and everything else, and right up, communism bad, communism bad. And all of a sudden, you've got Trump and Putin as best pals. And it's like two big bullies that are going to bully the rest of the world into allowing them total power. Horrendous, but it's also what Trump and Vance and the others, we used to call them hawks, didn't we? Don't seem to see the effect that this is going to have on the rest of the region, on the rest of Europe, ergo the rest of the world. Because you've got all these neighbouring states, Poland, Moldova. There's a really, really interesting article about Moldova in today's Observer, actually. Germany, even. They've all been suffering, things like cyber attacks and election interference from Putin already. So, does the President of the United States of America think that is acceptable? He seems to. So, there is a real danger of escalation if Putin is allowed to be getting away with this. And whilst I don't often have much good to say about Keir Starmer and David Lammy, I have to say I've been quite heartened by the stance that they have taken, particularly Lammy so far, and his rhetoric in relation to this. And I hope that this keeps up even when Starmer visits Trump. I think, is it this week, I think? I don't think you can go in full scale against Trump, and diplomacy has to come into it, because I think he's the kind of big Wayne that would just take the huff and stomp off and get onto X and start saying terrible things about Keir Starmer again. But I hope that the UK and the rest of Europe are able to stick together in this and have a united front, because the implications for the bully boys to be getting away with this are horrendous.
Thank you, Linda. Ian, we don't have much time, so briefly, if you can, that meeting that Starmer's requested with Trump next week, and Linda talked about how Lammy and Starmer have made a stand and come out and said that they disagree with what Donald Trump said when he accused Zelensky of being, a dictator and a warmonger, as you kind of implied, Linda. Isn't there a chance then, when that meeting between Starmer and Trump takes place, there's going to be journalists in the room and somebody's going to ask Trump, how does he feel about the fact that Starmer has said that what Trump has said is untrue, and that's going to be live on TV? Is that a possibility?
Well, just before going into that, the Daily Beast actually ran a story saying that Donald Trump was recruited as a KGB asset in 1987, and he was given the code name Krasnov, citing a former Soviet intelligence officer. Interestingly, the story was deleted on Saturday, but you can still see it on the Internet Wayback Machine. So that's quite an interesting development. In terms of the meeting which Keir Starmer is about to Donald Trump, traditionally, or for many years, in my view, British prime ministers have basically been far too close and too willing to jump to the tune of United States presidents. And we certainly saw this with Tony Blair in 2003 with Bush. So I'm sort of hoping that he will find some backbone, and he will basically stand up to Donald Trump and just tell him why his current approach is completely wrong. But who knows? What will go on in private. As far as what goes on in public, I guess it would be embarrassing if a journalist asked that question. But who knows? Keir Starmer will just have to find a way around that.
Okay, thank you, Ian. And again, Linda, just quickly, I don't know if you saw Stephen Fry on Laura Kuenssberg this morning, But Stephen Fry, when asked about this situation in Ukraine and Trump, but he said it was like a darkening shadow over the world, and called it fascism. Laura Kunsberg queried his choice of that word, and he maintained, he said it's a cult of power, and power only speaks to power. He went on to speak about Trump and Putin's contempt for politicians in the West, and mentioned J.D. Vance turning up in Germany, and how they've tried to push the far right of the AfD. And we're about to move on to the election in Germany today, but do you want to finish up maybe?
Aye, well, I would just say good on Stephen Fry, because it's not just what Trump and Musk and their pals are doing internationally. When you actually look at what they're doing domestically as well, there's some horrifying things going on. Absolutely awful. You know, not just, I mean, you hear the big stories about all these people getting sacked and stuff. Yeah, that's horrendous in itself. But when you look at the way Trump is sacking people here, there, and everywhere, heading up organisations, when you look at how he has taken over the committee that deals with the arts in the US, the main one in New York, I mean, that's major stuff, because then you're getting into the realms of governments deciding what the arts are for and what they should portray. So, yeah, good on Stephen Fry for actually coming out and saying this stuff. And I was having a wry smile there when Ian mentioned Tony Blair and George Bush, because I was thinking, oh my goodness, who would have thought all these years ago that someday I'd have been sitting thinking, you know what, Bush wasn't that bad. He was quite a good guy in comparison to what we have now. Time moves on. Yeah.
Thank you, Linda. And so today there is an election in Germany for a new chancellor. Germany's electoral system is highly proportional. They've got a proper PR system in. I think it's the biggest country in Europe. It's Christian. There's two parties historically have dominated German politics since the end of the Second World War. There's the Christian Democratic Union, or the CDU. They're a centre-right party, and the party of Helmut Kohl and Angela Merkel. And then there's the Social Democratic Party, the SDP, the party of the current Chancellor, Olaf Scholz. And then on the outside, there's a party which we've been hearing a lot about lately called the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland. Alice Weidel is the leader of that far-right party, which has been in the Bundestag since 2017. And a firewall prevents any other German parties going into coalition with them. So they've been denied a position of power, but they certainly have strength. If they're going to come out of the election with as big a number of people as the polls have been predicting. The current coalition there was three parties in that coalition, and so no surprise then that it didn't last very long and collapsed, and hence the snap election that's happening today. And I'm conscious that I'm speaking far too much, and so Linda, I'm going to come to you, and I do have a question if I can find it in my overly long notes. That I was thinking this thing about we hear that the UK's system, first past the post, is flawed but delivers a strong government, whereas proportional representation might be fairer, but then it means that you get a coalition and you also open the door to far right parties. Is that a fair criticism? I mean, you've worked in a you've worked in a
based on democracy. What is the most democratic way of going forward with the government? I mean, certainly when you look at the minority governments that have been in the UK, for a long, long time, there are people who don't feel they're represented, and it's not completely democratic. But you can then look at what you were talking about, which mainland Europe has a lot of the time coalitions, and they have the same in Ireland, of course. People generally feel they're represented, and whilst folk like me, and I know you yourself, Brian, and I suspect you are absolutely horrified at far right parties getting into parliaments. That's democracy. If people vote for them, they've got a voice there. The question is, what do you do when they arrive there? And you talked about a firewall that they currently have in Germany for not going into coalition with any of these people. And Then you have the hybrid system, which we have in the Scottish Parliament and the Welsh Parliament, where you have additional members that come in. And again, you know, all the opinion polls at the moment are saying that reform are going to end up getting into the Scottish Parliament on the regional list system at some point. So the teller is what the other parties do about that, in recognising that democracy has brought these people there. They can still decide, well, you know what, we're not going to go into any deals with them because we absolutely abhor what they stand for. So I can't remember, there was somebody famous once said that democracy was pretty grim, but it's the best of a bad lot. And, you know, perhaps that is where we are.
Thank you, Linda. And then about the actual election today, it's the chances are that there's going to be a centre-left coalition. But the Guardian said that their opinion that the result will be a turning point for the EU's most powerful member state as it comes to terms with Trump 2.0. Scholz, the current Social Democrat Chancellor, is probably going to be replaced by a chap called Friedrich Merz. Merz is a centre-left, I think. He's emphasised the need to stand up to... he's a Christian Democrat, centre-right in the politics spectrum. Merz has emphasised the need to stand up to bullying from Trump over Ukraine and potential trade tariffs. Is become increasingly hawkish to Russia and sees the need to protect the EU's eastern flank. Ian, it's a strong Germany at the heart of a strengthened Europe, and which distances itself from Trump. But is that going to be the result after today's election, do you think?
It's difficult to tell, but that would be, you know, my preferred outcome. The firewall, which basically prevents any of the other parties from doing a deal or even talking to the far right party, Alternative for Deutschland, is still there. But obviously, Vice President Vance, he kind of broke it by basically visiting them straight after the Munich event and talking to Alice Weidel, who's the ex-Goldman Sachs banker who leads AfD. I mean, the latest polls, according to, it's a poll off polls, show that the centre-right CDU-CSU is going to be on about 30%. The second biggest party will be Alternative for Deutschland with 20.6%. And then it's the Social Democrats on 15.5% and the Greens on 13%. So, you know, it's pretty divided. But if the firewall holds and if none of the other parties agree to do any deals or speak to the neo-Nazis, AfD, then I think we are on relatively safe ground. And, you know, Germany could take a leading role in establishing a European front against Trump and Musk and against Putin.
Thank you, Ian. And so, Linda, from what Ian's been saying there, we've got Trump in America, you've got Putin in Russia. It looks like with if there is the kind of outcome that we hope for, a centre-left coalition, and the AfD still kept behind its firewall, which Vance called undemocratic recently, well, it could be centre-left, possibly. So I've lost my thread now. Where is that going to lead Britain if Europe starts to strengthen itself against Trump in America and Putin in the East? What way does Britain start to face?
Well, who would know? Who would have thought we'd have been on the outside looking in a few years ago, which is where we've ended up, rather than being part of it. But I mean, I have for many years felt that the UK, even as part of the European Union, looked across the Atlantic far more than they should have, and should have been looking more across the Channel, if you like, to mainland Europe. But we didn't, and we've ended up isolated, against Scotland's wishes, of course. Where will we end up? I think that's why I am quite happy at the stance that Lammy and Starmer have taken so far, which would suggest to me that they're very strong with Europe on this particular issue. I hope that carries on. I mean, if we do get that centrist, and I hope we do centrist representation in Germany, and if Merz is as strong as he has been saying he will be about Europe, I would hope that the UK will stand with their partners in mainland Europe. Because we have to, back to that discussion we had earlier, the thoughts of what could be happening if Putin gets his way here are horrendous. And, there was, I think Ian mentioned that Vance is quite clearly supporting the Alternative for Deutschland. And so is Musk, because on that awful X platform of his, I noticed last night somebody copying that he's supporting quite clearly the AfD. And they are very far right. And when you look at the history of Germany, it must be so hard for the people to be looking at what's happening. And they have relied on the world order as it was put in place after the Second World War, with NATO for all its problems, and with Europe coming together. They have been looking at that as a good thing, generally, I believe. And there must be a lot of concern about what's now happening, which looks like this could fall apart. And in very many ways, although Britain, the UK, of course, was very much involved in both world wars, to a degree we have been sheltered from some of that because of our island nation status. But in mainland Europe, all the shifting borders that have been there over the decades, there must be real concern from a lot of people in a lot of countries in mainland Europe about how their life could just be thrown upside down yet again.
Thank you, Linda. Ian, we are out of time on this issue, but it doesn't seem right to leave it without mentioning just a couple of things. I started this item off by saying that first past the post delivers a strong government, and I think I also mentioned that AfD have been in the Bundestag since 2017, I think. But despite that, and that's possibly due to proportional representation, but we've got Nigel Farage and Tyson Westminster, despite our first past the post strong government system.
Yes.
And should we just mention populism? So is that
Yes. Well, I think the Reform Party, which includes Tice and Farage, would have many more members of the Westminster Parliament if we had PR. I think they've only got, is it 4? But to judge by the percentage of the vote that Reform got in July, I think they'd have many more if we had proportional representation. So to that extent, we have our own sort of firewall against the far right. But now, with the Tories in disarray and with Labour seemingly failing over the last 7 months in multiple ways, there is a serious danger that Reform under Nigel Farage and Richard Tice could actually do relatively well in the next UK general election, and they could potentially do much better than they have done in the past in the Scottish one in May 26. So that is a concern. But I mean, I think the AfD, I haven't lived in Germany. I've only visited the country sporadically, so I wouldn't say I fully understand the context there. But it does seem as if the AfD is particularly popular in the former East Germany, the former DDR. It is the dominant political force there, and I don't know the reasons for that. Whether people feel economically left behind, or they feel they particularly feel that immigrants may have harmed their standard of living, and Germany did allow in roughly 1 million Syrian refugees in 2015, and ultimately a lot of people claim that was the kind of turning point which fueled the rise of AfD under Alice Weidel. But they have got some weird policies which are quite similar to Reform's. They want to vote on leaving the EU. Well, Reform's done that, or when it was called UKIP. They want to scrap climate change measures. I think Reform pretty much wants to do that. They want to abandon, net zero targets. They want to build nuclear power plants, and I believe Reform wants to do that. And they want to repair relations with Russia and also repair gas pipelines that come from Russia. So in many ways, the two parties are quite similar.
Thank you, Ian. Yeah, I think you're right. It's mainly people living in what used to be Eastern Germany, and mostly young men as well, that seem to be going to support them. But the AfD, just to finish on them, are actually under investigation by the authorities because of their far-right dangerous activities. But I suppose we better move on because time really is against us. So the UK government has plans for a legal definition of English single malt whisky. It took me a while to work this out because I'm not very clever at things like this, but I think I've got it now. The plan, it seems to me, is to produce an English single malt whisky, but it would be produced by multiple distilleries who would produce the alcohol from the malted barley. That would then be sent to a single chosen distillery for a final distillation, thereby allowing England to claim that it's a single malt. But by my definition, I would kind of think that is probably going to be what we would call a blend. But it's also about geographical indicators. The UK Department for the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA, announced it's considering making an application for protected geographical status for English single malt whisky. Ruth Watson of Keep Scotland the Brand, who's often on this show, would understand this. And the Scottish Whisky Association put it well when they said, single malt whisky is famous for its integral connection to place. And this plan for an English single malt fails to understand or even acknowledge that very simple yet important fact. And Ian, it is actually your turn to answer this one first, if you've got any thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, I think that the main issue here is that the English whisky distilleries, of which there are 27, producing already single malt English whiskies, are wanting to have what's called GI, which means geographical indication. So they can actually uniquely claim that like Harris Tweed can only be made in Harris, Scotch whisky can only be made in Scotland, and English whisky can only be made in England. That doesn't exist at the moment. So they're going for what's called GI. The Welsh whisky, single malt whisky distillers have already achieved this. They have a GI. But the problem, as far as Scotland is, as far as the Scotch Whisky Association, which represents the largest Scotch whisky companies, but not all Scotch whisky companies, is that the way they define single malt is a looser definition than we have here in Scotland. So at the moment in Scotland, to be called single malt, it has to be mashed, fermented, and distilled at the same distillery site. So when you buy Talisker, the mashing, the fermentation, and the distillation has all been done at Talisker by Diageo. The problem with the English ones is they're trying to say, well, we don't have the facilities to do that. We're only small. We're only just getting started. We want just to do this, the distillation here and allow the mashing and the fermentation to be done in other places, but we still want to call it single malt. So I think we have got an almighty battle looming. And the Scotch Whisky Association is fantastic. It's brilliant with its PR. You know, the day this application was made was open to consultation by DEFRA in Whitehall, it came out with its response saying this is a disgrace and will damage the reputation of Scotch single malt. So we'll have to wait and see what happens. One thing I would say is actually there is a slight hypocrisy on the part of the Scotch Whisky Association because they allowed Wales to do exactly what England is trying to do now. So Wales already got the right to do what England is wanting to do, and numerous other countries in the world, including America, do more or less what England is trying to do, and they still call it single malt. So you could argue the SWA has been a wee bit hypocritical.
Thank you. And I think maybe the SWA might also be accused of being a wee bit hypocritical because they were against Scottish independence, and if they'd maybe been for it, then we wouldn't be in this situation. But Linda, the First Minister, John Swinney's vowed to protect Scotland's whisky industry from what he sees as an attempt to dilute its value, and he argued that any move to weaken the definition of a single malt could lead to job losses and harm the economy, especially in rural Scotland. And I don't know if you, like me, do you detect somewhere, although it's not mentioned, the word Brexit kind of hovering around here
Oh,
anywhere?
First of all, John Swinney, of course, he's doing that as First Minister, but also John is very knowledgeable about this because he represents a Tayside constituency. So he knows all about it, and no doubt he's been getting lobbied furiously as well. I'm really grateful to Ian for laying all that out so clearly for me, but I'm still outraged, I have to say. I don't know why the SWA, of which I'm not generally a fan, I don't know why the Scotch Whisky Association didn't start creating when it was Wales. Maybe they didn't feel it was a threat. But when you look at the potential size of the production and distribution that could be in England compared to Wales and or Scotland, it's pretty huge. So I think we do have to fight to protect this. I mean, Scotland started not that long ago in whisky terms producing blended malts. Um, but they're all labelled very clearly. It's very, very upfront. This is not a single malt, this is a blended malt. And I think that's the right way to go. So I do think there's a Brexit thing because the whole protected status thing that we got through the European Union for various things, tying in with Ruth Scotland the brand campaign as well, was great for Scotland because we have a lot of Stornoway Black Pudding's another one, for example, Arbroath Smokies, all these things. Are they all at risk now as well? We have long been worried that Brexit would affect the efficacy of our food and drink produce, and here is something that is very much affecting it. So this may be the only time you will ever have me in record saying I support the Scotch Whisky Association. So there you go, a first.
Thank you, Linda. And we have to move on, but I was also just thinking, I wonder, again, Brexit's at the back of this, but when you hear about the news of what's happening to English waterways and water, that thing about place in the ingredients for Scottish malt whisky, water's a really important one. And when you think about the quality of English water, would you lift a bottle off the shelf for a Scottish whisky? I wonder. Maybe they can
Well, maybe
differentiate.
the alcohol makes it safe.
That's true. Disinfectant, yeah. Or maybe they could differentiate it by putting another E in there somewhere, the way they do between Scottish and Irish whiskies. But, yeah, moving on. Yesterday, Friday, I think, started the Scottish Labour Conference in Glasgow. Let me see, where are my notes on that? In a speech to conference, Anas Sarwar said he would copy Elon Musk by setting up his own Doge department to reduce the size of the Scottish government civil service and close public bodies. He also said that I am ready to give back to the country that has given me so much. That is why today I am submitting my application to be the next First Minister of Scotland. Linda, I thought you'd submitted that application to BFM some time ago. Do you think it's gotten
Heard it all
lost?
before, yeah. Yeah, you're right. And that was the first thing I thought as well when I heard it all before. Uh, I mean, I think Anas Sarwar at the moment is just desperate. He has been humiliated by all the promises that he and Jackie Baillie, his deputy, made before the general election about all the fantastic things that were going to come with the Labour government. What was it? Watch my lips, there will be no austerity. They were going to save Grangemouth. They were going to do all sorts. They were going to recompense the WASPy women. They were going to do all sorts of wonderful things. And the UK government has said, no, that's not going to happen. The two-child cap, there's another thing. There's loads of examples. So I think Anas Sarwar at the moment is just desperate and he's scrabbling around for any kind of importance at all and to get his name in the paper and be seen as a strong leader. However, I think it's all talk. There's not a lot there. And this latest stuff, about creating this Elon Musk copycat thing is just horrendous. And when I think of what the Labour Party came from, a very proud Labour movement and stood for great things, to hear a Scottish Labour leader standing up and backing people like Elon Musk and thinking he's got good ideas, well, I think that's absolutely appalling, and I think people will see through it. And the other element of it is he could say whatever he likes and what he wants to do, but at the end of the day, he's a branch office, and it is Keir Starmer and the UK government who will decide what happens in Scotland. And whilst many of us have talked about that for a long time, it's only in the last few days that Henry McLeish, a former First Minister of Scotland, has been very open in a BBC interview and saying that he and the others that have been First Minister for Labour were unable to do anything without London say so, and were in fact instructed about what was to happen in Scotland. So I'm trying to think of a polite expression to use for Annis. Wind and against comes into mind, but I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. That thing about how he wants to have the equivalent, a Scottish equivalent of Elon Musk's Doge. Kevin Stewart, the SNP MSP, said, so far Musk's Doge department has cut funding to medical research products, cancelled education contracts and sacked thousands of public sector workers. Which one of those cuts has impressed Sarwar the most? Ian, do you have anything that you'd like to add?
I think the last Labour leader who I found impressive was Joan Lamont back in 2011 to 14. There's been a pretty rum bunch of Labour leaders since her, in my mind. Maybe Bailey is a reasonably good operator, but I'm not particularly impressed by her as a politician. In terms of this speech that he gave on Friday, I think David Bull, who is deputy political editor for The Scotsman and is, I think, a very good journalist, said it was all just fairy tales. He was talking about a lot of, motherhood and apple pie type things. A tax on Amazon or an Amazon tax, which would be charged on online retailers. 48-hour guarantee for GP appointments, the Doge thing you just mentioned, Department of Government Efficiency a la Elon Musk, nuclear power, ending peak time pricing on rail fares, using private sector pension funds to build new homes, elected mayors for Scottish cities, a national care service, business tax relief, etc., ending the housing crisis. These are all worthy ideas. Many of these, apart from Doge, are worthy ideas. But even if he was in Butey's, would he be able to actually implement any of these? Or B, will he ever actually enter Butey's?
Yeah, thank you, Ian. All the individual items that you pointed out there, I think at the end of the speech, it was just Anas Sarwar saying, when I am First Minister, I will, and went through all of those in bullet points, and so it did kind of, to my ear, ring a bit thin. Linda,
apparently,
yes,
in his speech, he didn't mention trade unions one time, but he mentioned business about 10 times, and he didn't, and he mentioned himself becoming First Minister over 30 times in the speech. Or something like that.
Yeah, and no mention of trade unions either, because they were protesting outside. Linda, have you heard about the news that came out of the Labour conference that there's going to be DWP policies imposed on Scotland? The Shadow Justice spokesperson Paul O'Kane told Labour conference that his party would be open to cutting any of the support payments made by Social Security Scotland, except for the Scottish Child Payment. That means that the Labour government in Scotland would be open to cutting pensioners' winter fuel payments, to child benefit cap, which is currently mitigated. That would possibly go. Both adult and child disability payments could go, and carer support payments could go. Is that news to you?
Oh, that is news to me, Brian. Unfortunately, it's not surprising news because when you look at some of what Rachel Reeves has been saying down south, that sort of copies in. I mean, she's now talking about cutting potential of cutting disability payments to some people who are in long-term disability, and even in saying they were going to cut these and the money that would be saved by that, she wasn't even looking to put it into job creation or job support or things like that. She's talking about using it in the general budget. So I'm not surprised to hear that, is it Paul Kane, I think was the name you said, was talking about it. It's just awful. I go back to the "watch my lips, there'll be no austerity" quotes from before. How can you trust any of these people? And another element that I'm finding really, really difficult is the propensity that Scottish Labour have at the moment to try and outdo the Tories. And when you look at where the Tories are at, you're talking Tories and reform, and Labour don't seem to be distancing themselves enough for that. And so many of the issues that we have in the UK, ergo Scotland, at the moment, are a direct result of all these years of Tory rule. Yet, what you have is a Labour group in the Scottish Parliament who never seem to slag off the Tories about any of that, about the legacy they left. They just seem intent on doing the SNP bad rhetoric all the time. And I don't for a minute think that John Swinney and previous leaders have got everything right for the SNP. It's one party I'm talking about. We have never had everything right. We should never claim to have got everything right. But boy, oh boy, have we tried. And when you look at the alleviation of child poverty progress that we have made in comparison to what's happened south of the border, and you then hear Labour people at their conference in Scotland saying that they are quite willing to look at cutting a lot of these things, it's a bad, bad place for the Labour Party to be.
Thank you, Linda. And again, we're out of time on this one, but just before we do leave it, Linda, I wonder if you would say that there's been another Westminster voting intention for Scotland poll where the SNP have come out on 36% is in Scotland, Labour, but for MP seats in Westminster, Labour on 17%. Reform UK on 16%, Lib Dems on 12%, Conservatives on 11%, the Greens on 6%, with others on 2%. Seat projection wise, that would give the SNP 47 seats, which is 38 up on their current number. The Lib Dems would get 6 on no change. In Westminster, Conservatives would be on 3, that's down 2, and Labour would be on 1, that's a drop of 36 seats in Westminster. Does that surprise you, Linda?
Not particularly, I have to say. I think the result of the general election last year in July, where the SNP got hammered, absolutely hammered, but we got hammered on a false premise, which is becoming more and more obvious as it goes. So no, I'm not surprised that people in Scotland will have seen through that, and that these opinion polls look very different. Horrified at the potential for reform, I have to say, just horrified.
Okay, thank you.
But we're at where we're at.
Did you say reform was on? Sorry, could you repeat what the parties were after the SNP?
So Labour on 17% and Reform on 16%. This is voting intentions in Scotland, Ian, but for Westminster seats.
And the Tories on 12. So Reform.
Conservatives on 11.
11.
Lib Dem on 12.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That does seem surprising.
Yeah,
but maybe not surprising, but it just shows how weak the other parties are. If the SNP is that high, I mean, you said 36% for the SNP.
Yeah, it sounds like buyer's remorse, perhaps on the part of some Labour voters, I would suggest. But we better squeeze in. The fact is, so next week there is going to be a vote on the final version of the Scottish Government's budget in Holyrood. The Greens and the Lib Dems both got some concessions, and so they're going to back it. So it will probably be passed. The Tories have said that they will vote against it. The big question seems to be is, will Scottish Labour abstain? And if they do, what kind of effect is that going to have on their pollings in Scotland? Ian, what are your thoughts about next week's vote for the Scottish budget?
Get it through quite. Are you okay?
Yes, we're good. Thank you. Carry on.
It seems like the SNP government, led by John Swinney, is going to sail through. Get this budget through quite readily, because it's only a rump of Tories who are going to vote against. The Lib Dems are voting in favour. The Greens are voting in favour, and Labour's abstaining, as far as I know. So I think Jonah Robertson and John Swinney created a budget which might, when they put their budget together last December or in November, they crafted it in a way which they believed might be palatable to some of the other rival parties, and they seem to have achieved that by offering certain concessions. And I can't remember what the exact concessions are, to little morsels to the Greens and little morsels to the Lib Dems. And the Lib Dems seem to have abandoned one of their red lines on this, which was no money for independence or something. But even so, I think it's politically, it shows that the Swinney-led government is politically very astute.
Thank you, Ian. I think that, Alex Cole-Hamilton said that they hadn't abandoned a red line, and that they had achieved the no money being spent on Scottish independence. But Linda, apparently Michael Mara, Labour MSP, in the Stage 1 debate for the budget explained Scottish Labour's reason for possibly abstaining, we think. He said Scottish Labour will not stand in the way of this budget because they desperately want to see Labour's record investment improve delivery on the front line, but we will not vote for this budget because they very much doubt that it will. He claimed there were years and years of experience to a complete lack of delivery from previous SNP budgets. Does that...
Well, do you know, Brian, all I
wash?
would say is the whole time I was in Parliament, from when the SNP took government in 2007 up until 2021 when I retired, Labour never constructively took part in any budget discussions at all. They were just oppositionists right from the start. And from what I understand, from what I've read that John Swinney has said and Shona Robertson has said, they were the only party, yet again this time, who did not actively enter into discussions. It's because they're completely devoid of ideas, completely devoid of any inspiration. And I think if they abstain again with the potential of cutting funding to alleviate, for example, child poverty, along with other things, I think they just look ridiculous, and people just see through it for what it is.
Yeah, it does. I would like to go on, but Linda, I'm conscious that you've got the rest of the weekend to get on with, as do you, Ian. So maybe we should just call it a day there, shall we? So that's it for this week's Full Scottish. But before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on your generosity, to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment. We thank you very much. We were £16,000 short of our funding requirements in 2024, which has left us short of the money we need to pay our bills. We face costs of around £4,000 every month, and we gratefully received donations of about 2,500. We need to raise at least £8,000 to pay our bills now. You know that our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, and please donate whatever you can afford. Meanwhile, thank you once again to both my guests, to you, Linda, and also to you, Ian, for your time and your patience with me. Really appreciate it, and hope to see you both again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that's it. So I'll let you get on with the rest of the weekend, but goodbye and thank you for watching.